So much has changed since Drew and I did our quarantine Quagmire episode back in March. And I remember both of us took somewhat of an optimistic approach for the most part. We talked about how a crisis can positively change the trajectory of a society or even the globe. We looked into the bubonic plague, how it actually paved the way for job equality and wealth growth. Back in March, the crisis seemed like it was going to be a good time to bring people together. Sadly, it hasn't. And we've seen this all go completely to hell. And since then, we are seeing higher death numbers, higher hospitalizations, and just higher cases of COVID than ever before in the United States right now. And so today we are going to talk about that again, unfortunately. So, Drew, how are you? Not a rosy topic. It's interesting. Back in March, I remember we were kind of hoping by now things would be better. So, what are your thoughts on this? What's changed? What's happened? I don't know.
It's a weird thing to feel like you have a 2020 hindsight on something that's still currently going on. You know what I mean? Like,
Mm-hmm.
we're still in the thick of it. In fact, everything we're hearing from experts and officials is saying that, like, we're about to see the worst of it. And we're in the worst of it. And we are. And and yet I do feel like I have this 2020 hindsight because, you know, I mean, uh, we we really like worry. Like I was worried, like if we can come together, we can do this. But if we get divided politically and it becomes this political issue, we're screwed, right? And I'm not a sage, right? I'm not an oracle. A lot of people had that same thought because we all saw it starting to happen, you know, and we didn't know how bad it was going to get. Well, now that we're in November, almost December, we've seen it. We've seen it become a huge political wedge, a political issue. And while there are people that are against um, science and critical thinking on all sides, I do think that the majority of people that are against mask wearing and against COVID precautions are on the right. And you have people that are more willing to listen to scientific experts and more willing to obey shutdowns and lockdowns on the left. And it shouldn't be that way. It shouldn't be political. And now we're seeing the effects of how millions of people have gotten this virus, hundreds of thousands of Americans dead, or almost 260,000 as of recording right now. And that's 250,000 Americans dead that didn't need to. And so I see it as like I see it as a huge wake up call for our country of how much we really need to change the American culture of distrust for our
Mm-hmm.
government. It was romantic for a time. It was cool to be, we can't trust our government, individualism. And believe me, there are governments out there that have earned have earned people not trusting them, right? There are definitely governments that are not worth trusting. But it's so ingrained in American culture that even when we need government trust the most, when we really need people to just listen to scientific experts that recommend, certain laws, we can't do that, and hundreds of thousands of people have died. So for this, now that we're in Quarantine Quagmire Part 2, like I'm incredibly disappointed in the American people.
Yeah, man. I'll never forget. In Spain when we were told that we're going to be now teaching from home and working from home, and I was, there was kind of at the beginning there was a nice sense of cool. I'm going to have more time at home to work on things, and I had the luxury of living in a country where the government did step in, and they put out some pretty hefty fines and even potential jail time if you violated curfews. And I know at the time I was strongly against it because I thought it was a violation of human rights, and also it could have a scary slide into authoritarian tendencies. But ironically, the U.S. is one of the only countries in the West, especially, that hasn't had a unified federal response. And also, we're one of the countries, in my opinion, that actually has had some slides into authoritarianism. While countries like Spain, for example, that have enforced, nationwide curfews, mask wearing, stay-at-home orders, I don't really see Spain having changed much over the last year. I know that's always a big talking point on the right as well. If you give government this power in a time of crisis, when is it going to go backwards? And I think sometimes that's true, especially with stuff like the Patriot Act. That was a huge violation of human rights and just privacy in general. But I honestly think this is different. I think you need a federal response in order to deal with something that is global. And I don't think the U.S. is the only country that's politicized it. I mean, I've
No,
seen
sure.
videos in Spain and England. Anti-vaxxers are everywhere, right? The right in most countries seems to be against it for different reasons, but it's usually religion, anti-science, or individual rights, like in the United States. But I think the difference is that it's not only perpetuated by our leaders, but it's also become instrumental in the culture war. I've seen people say it's less about, maybe the virus isn't serious. I mean, there's definitely people that say that too, but it's mainly, I don't want to wear a mask, or I don't want to stay home because it's against my personal freedom. And David Brooks, who, for people who don't know, he's a New York Times conservative. He's also on PBS with Brooks and Shield, or I mean, with Mark Shields and David Brooks. They're kind of like Drew and I, honestly, kind of have discussions where they agree and disagree on things. David Brooks is a conservative, but he wrote in his recent book, he talks about how there's a shift to hyper individualism that happened in the 1970s, and he thinks it's actually the reason why Americans are lonely, depressed, and isolated.
Mm.
And he thinks it's become detrimental to our culture. It's basically, in quotes, I'm just going to read it. He says, hyper individualism, the reigning ethos of our day, is a system of morals, feelings, ideas, and practices based on the idea that the journey through life is an individual journey, that the goals of life are individual happiness, authenticity, self-actualization, and self-sufficiency. Hyper-individualism puts the same question on everyone's lips. Sorry, what can I do to make myself happy? And David Brooks thinks that that's why we're isolated and lonely, but he also thinks that's why we are having a crisis with COVID that a lot of other countries aren't. It's because Americans really don't. It's kind of in our ethos that we don't really need to work together. We're not a communitarian society at all. And I think that's going to be detrimental to us. But it's that hyper individualism that I'm on my own. I want to do what's best for me. And that's kind of what we're seeing with COVID, unfortunately.
I think you're right, and that's what I mean. Like we have to get rid of that culture because it's killing people,
Yeah.
and it's like it sometimes just comes down to people don't want to be told what to do, and especially Americans. And unfortunately, when dealing with complex things like viruses, airborne viruses, sometimes you have to be told what to do. You have to be
Mm-hmm.
told wash your hands, wear a mask, you know, don't go to a concert full of 200 people indoors. I don't know. It's just like, and you're right that there are anti-vaxxers and it's there's political issues everywhere. But I think by far, the United States has had one of the worst examples of like no national response, a confusing national response. Dr. Fauci says one thing, and then Trump right after will say, well, I'm not going to wear a mask. I mean, you can if you want to, if it's recommended, but it's not forced. I'm not going to. And then no one does. It's like we really screwed the pooch. And I
Mm-hmm.
mean, not just us too. I also pulled up here. Now that we do have a little bit of time and knowledge and hindsight, right? Back in the first episode, we talked about Sweden trying out their herd immunity. And we said, well, at the time we said the cats, you know, we don't know yet. We'll have to see what happens with this. Well, it looks like it didn't work. And Sweden has admitted it. Let me see if I can pull up here. But Sweden says it sees no signs herd immunity is stopping the virus. The encouraging recent news as well as the encouraging recent news on vaccines does not mean a life will return to normal anytime soon, experts warn. So, we had Sweden trying a herd immunity thing, and that was something that Trump and his administration was touting as an alternative to lockdowns. It didn't work. Now we know that didn't work, right? Now we have see the evidence that didn't work. We have to learn from things like this, and I don't think that, especially the Trump administration. I mean, he's given up. I mean, he's not even focusing on it. He's still caring about this election steal or whatever. He's completely given up on the coronavirus. So I don't know. I mean, like, if anything, it shows that we have a serious problem in the country with the culture of individualism, like you said. We have a serious problem with distrust of scientific officials and experts, right? People just don't trust experts and get sent death threats to Fauci when Fauci is not a political person. Fauci does not have a grand agenda. Fauci is not like bought out by the George Soros, deep state. The dude is just a nerd who wants to make sure we're healthy.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really true. I was always appalled when I first heard that even his kids and wife needed security. What is wrong with people, man? Like, and I think to me, I mean, we've talked about this. Like the U.S. right now is extremely open to conspiracies, and unfortunately, I think also with COVID, which is something I didn't even think would be a problem back in March when we talked about this originally, was that I didn't really imagine this conspiratorial fringe really almost being a detriment to saving lives, and that's what I think has made it so much worse is because it's a new virus, and even people like Fauci, have had to change their have changed what they've publicly said because the virus is changing, it's evolving, we're studying it as we speak, and because he said don't wear masks and then wear masks, that was to save supplies, right? N95 masks were in a shortage, and we needed healthcare workers and first responders to get them. But for a lot of Americans, that was well, no one knows what they're talking about, and I I think the true hypocrisy, though, comes from our actual leaders, and I will even say on both sides to a certain extent. It's obviously much worse on the left, or I mean, on the right, definitely not on the left. I think people like Mark Meadows should never work again. Honestly, I say that with a full stop after it, because this is a guy who basically, honestly, and I give him props for honesty, basically said we've given up. He's like, we're just going to let this run through the population. And science, like you said, it does not show that herd immunity with this virus works. And studies have shown, I think, that by the time, yeah, The Economist had an article where it was basically by the time that herd immunity could be reached with COVID, we could see close to 1 million deaths in the United States. So, not going to work. And Mike Pence penned that op-ed in June that said there's never going to be a second wave. Well,
Now in the
I don't even
third.
know. Yeah, I don't even know. Arguably, if we ever passed the first wave, because we never really quelled anything here. And but I also get pissed off with people like Gavin Newsom and with Nancy Pelosi, because Gavin Newsom was I well, it's not because I'm actually angry at the policies therefore with COVID, but it's the do as I say, not as I do mantra that
Sure.
unfortunately just like fuels this conspiracy fringe on the right. Gavin Newsom enacted that strict curfew, from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. right now. You can't leave your house. A lot of counties aren't enforcing it. But then he's caught inside a restaurant eating maskless with health officials and lobbyists that same week. I can't go inside a restaurant. Drew, I don't think you can go inside a restaurant. People can't go to gyms. And so it just seems very hypocritical. And then, Nancy Pelosi, back in June or July, had that, barbershops are closed and she's out getting her hair blown out, maskless, all this stuff. Like
Yeah,
that
yeah.
just fuels the right. And
No, you're definitely right. I mean, they shouldn't have done those things. That's terrible optics. And of course, you never want to have the do as I say, not as I do as a politician. It's just
right.
stupid that they do that. And I understand why people are pissed. But like, I think now it's at this point, it's like, okay, because we saw places that were closing down at 6,000 cases and then opening back up at 600,000 cases. So there was a lot of things that just didn't make sense. It didn't make logical sense. And
Mm-hmm.
and so for people to say, like, well, there's just nothing we can do. We're just gonna have to let it run its course. It's like, no, we didn't even get it right the first time. We didn't even effectively attempt the first time because half of you didn't wear masks. We didn't shut down the schools at the right time, and we opened them back up at the wrong time. So it's like, it's like I know people thinking like, well, we didn't get it right. Well, just let it run its course. It's like, no, dude, we didn't even try the correct route. We didn't even do it
Mm-hmm.
right. We haven't even done it right. People haven't even listened the first time. So I really feel like, we have to put some blame somewhere, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so yes, a little bit of blame has to go to China. They should have been more transparent. They should have been working better early on. The World Health Organization should have been more transparent and less defensive of China early on. But then the blame does go onto the Trump administration because, like you said, we are one of the few countries that really didn't have a national response. We now have seen since then that with all the different waves, the United States is doing worse off than some of our comparable nations. Even though Europe's in a third wave as well, and they're having to shut down again as well, we've still had it worse off throughout this time. And let's give ourselves credit, Alex. We predicted a lot of things, man. Because I remember
Yeah, we did.
when we were talking about in quarantine Quagmire at the time, it was California and New York and big left-leaning metropolitan cities, and people in the country. We were like, it was widespread, and Jared Kushner was like, that's not even our voters, right? And we said, look, Trump has to be careful, though, because eventually it will get out to his base. It will get out to the Midwest. Look at what happened with the election. Coronavirus became the number one issue on voters' minds. And by the time the election came around, it was. It was out in the fields. It was out in the countryside. It was out in Trump country. And now it is decimating the American Midwest. It is decimating states like Texas. It is decimating states like Michigan. It's decimating the entire Midwest area. And it did. It got out to the country. And I kind of feel like nothing even happened to try and stop that. A lot of states in the Midwest, Oklahoma especially, Florida, not in the Midwest, but Florida, kind of Trump country, they just didn't take any precautions that were recommended. They were lackluster in their approach. They were poorly timed with their school closings, and now they are suffering for it. And they had no direction from the federal government.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. And, as our listeners, I'm sure know, I like to play devil's advocate here, but there's really no devil's advocate in this. I think you're absolutely correct. It trickles down, like this stuff trickles down from the top. And the only reason why DeSantis in Florida, that's the governor for people who might not know, the only reason why he was opposing masks and lockdowns was because Trump told him to. That was the only reason most of these conservatives did it, is because they wanted to stay loyal to Trump, because their base likes Trump, and it all starts and ends with Trump. And I thought it was just appalling when he got COVID and then bragged about how it's nothing. And he also got the best treatment in the world, experimental drugs. And there's people in the country who don't even have access to healthcare, and he's saying, "Oh, it's nothing. I brushed it off," and that's a horrible messaging. That's horrible messaging. And I did want to get back to how you mentioned so like the lockdowns weren't enough. I think that's also part of the problem. I know so many people just personally who are like, that 2-week lockdown turned into 6 months. It's like, yeah, because it was half-assed and shitty the first time. It didn't work. So like, yeah, obviously we've been locked down longer than most of us expected. Well, we're not even locked down, dude. Give me like like most of the country's not locked down. Both of us have Instagrams. I mean, on my story, I see people having huge parties right now. We're not locked down. So that's why when people are like, "Oh my gosh, I'm worried about being locked down," I'm like, no, this is not a lockdown. Like people have been pretty much free to do most things except for go to businesses. And I think that's actually where the first stimulus, didn't do enough for actual small businesses. Like Applebee's and what's the cheesecake place? What's it called? The Cheesecake Factory.
Yeah.
They got stimulus money. They don't need stimulus money. I'm sorry. And I think the problem is that a lot of actual small gyms, businesses, they didn't really get much. So they were kind of just forced to stay open because they could. So you had this contradicting message where people were told to stay home and not go into public places. But then, small bars and gyms were allowed to stay open. So if you're an average person who wants to work out, if the gym's open, you're going to probably go. And that's because these businesses had to make ends meet. And I think that's the problem, is we never really had enough money going to private businesses. So people got double messaging. And it's really too bad, because so many businesses are still going to go under. And I don't think we've even got to the beginning of the economic problems from this. And I'm sorry, I'm ranting here, but I really hate the argument that if we didn't lock down, the economy wouldn't be bad. Every plague and pandemic in history has led to some form of a recession, or just, shock in markets, or not markets, but bartering, whatever it might have been, because people are afraid to go out and spend money. So I think it's BS that the lockdowns caused the economic problems. It was the lack of government. And I'm kind of a conservative still. I actually changed my party after this election. I'm an independent now, but
Hey.
I still do. Yeah, that's a long story, but I do agree with big government in times of crisis, and big government didn't respond, and small businesses basically convoluted the waters because they had to. Rant over, sorry.
No, I mean, you're right. And I think that stimulus part of it is another big aspect of this, the quarantine quagmire theme, is like, that's another quagmire, is people are still losing their jobs. People are still applying for unemployment. Businesses are still going out of business. And we have seen that our government has been more than willing to, gather, circle the wagons over judge appointments and this and that. but they were only able to come out with one real stimulus for the American people. And like you said, a lot of that went to big businesses like Applebee's. I also saw, by the way, that stimulus money went to mega churches, strangely enough, right? Large and evangelical pastors got fat racks from the U.S. government out of that stimulus bill, and American people got one measly check for $1,200. Not enough. Not enough when you are, if you're a service worker who worked at a hotel, and now your hotel's gone because no one's going to hotels, or an airline, or a cruise worker, or like you said, the small businesses, the small local barbershops, the local Chinese restaurant, these places that are going out of business because of this. A one check for $1,200 is not enough. And that's a part of this quagmire. Is it's just so obvious how much our government, like how our how Congress, how slow they are to really help the people, and how quick they are to help their political agendas.
Yeah, I was actually talking with a few buddies last night about this, and one of my buddies, he basically said that, and I think he's even a little more right than I used to be or am. I don't know, but he basically said that what pisses him off about, especially people like Mitch McConnell, are that they're always opposing these things, but it doesn't really matter for them. They're old. Like, to be completely honest, people like Mitch McConnell aren't going to be alive in 10 years.
Nope.
And a lot of economists, like Newsweek, put out a kind of scary article where basically 125 economists said that if we don't do something soon, there could be over a decade of long-lasting economic problems from this.
We just got out of a decade of long-lasting economic problems. Yeah.
Exactly, man. And that impacts you and I personally, because our generation really hasn't ever been in the working population during a time of great economic stability. And so that's worrying to me for people who are maybe, let's say, between like 18 and 40. There's a lot of people that have really never seen this American dream that, our parents and grandparents talk about. And today, Senator Debbie Stabenow, who's the fourth ranking Democrat in the upper chamber, she said that she's willing to compromise on a smaller aid package with Republicans because we need something now. And I think that's the problem now, is that like back to what I was originally saying, is that people like Mitch McConnell, they're not going to reap the outcomes of whatever their decisions are.
Yeah.
So it's easy for them to just oppose anything, and that's really irritating. And yeah, like Democrats and Republicans need to even get a skinny stimulus plan now. Biden wants 3 million. Conservatives, I remember back in July, wanted billion. So Biden wants 3 billion. Republicans back in July wanted 1 billion. Can't we compromise? 1.5, 2 billion. Let's get something out there, man, because something's better than nothing, and that's what's happened here.
And get more money in the hands of people. Like, I know, like, again, I'm talking about that idea of like we have to get rid of some archaic and counterproductive parts of American culture. That whole thing about like we can't have any handouts, no handouts. Are you kidding me? That $1,200 handout for the pandemic was one of the best moves like we could have done. I mean, people like if you could go back and look at what people said they spent it on, most of it was groceries, bills, school supplies. Like, it's not like, I mean, yeah, we saw the memes of people like, I'm going to buy a $1,200 TV. Is that also a bad thing? Is that a bad thing to have economic activity, to go to Best Buy and buy a TV? Or it's also not a bad thing either for the mom with the one kid to use that money to pay off her bills, to pay off her cell phone so that she can use her cell phone to apply to jobs, right? Like, this idea that handouts are such a sin is like, okay, we're in a pandemic, right? We are in a pandemic. We have to get rid of these notions. We have to think outside of the box. Frankly, I was even shocked that we even got that first round because of how crazy something like because remember, we were talking about UBI and everything. There's a whole breadth of conversations around that policy. Like, do we just start giving people money in this world? And it did push a lot of people forward in that conversation that I didn't think were even willing to have it. So I was even surprised we had the first round of money. But I think it worked, and I think we should do more, especially in a pandemic. If you're, people need the help, and bad. And to fight against lockdowns, but then to not have any, benefit for people, right? It's like, do you really care about people? Because, like, I get it. If you're going to lock people down, you need to make sure they have some help at home. And that's what Democrats have been arguing for.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think Democrats have been in the right for most of this, and it's not easy for me to say, but I do think that they have had the better interest of people that need help. And but now I just wanted to mention this, and then I do want to ask you about the vaccine before we get out of here. But
Sure.
I I did like what I've been thinking for a while is that I almost feel like Republicans took the temperature of the culture war and decided to turn COVID into that because I feel like there's two types of well, I'm obviously generalizing a lot here, but there's two types of people during this lockdown. There's people who are, supporting lockdowns and telling people wear a mask and stay home. And those are the people that can work from home. Those are the people that it really doesn't change their life if they stay home.
That's a good
And
point.
right, and then you have, factory workers, first responders, service industry people that can't work from home. And so when they hear the message from people like Trump saying lockdowns are bad for you economically, like they just want to ruin your job, like I understand how that appeals to people. That kind of goes back to that rural urban divide episode we did last week, is that it's really easy from a tech guy in San Francisco to say, yeah, I'm going to work from home, everyone should wear a mask and stay home. Yeah, that's easy, man. Sitting at your, golden palace looking out at people, yeah, lovely. But there's a lot of Americans who can't stay home. And so like you were saying, like the problem is we kind of took the worst case scenario on both sides. We took a lockdown and no economic relief, and what it created was a hyper divided American
Yeah,
workforce.
yeah. You needed to have that because like I'm in that boat. Like I mean, you kind of called me out, and you should because I do need to remember that because you're right. I have to remember that my perspective is I have a job. I've had a full-time job this whole time, and I work from home, and I have that luxury. And so it is easy for me to be like, yeah, stay home, wear a mask. I can do it all day.
Mm-hmm.
And you're right that it's not everyone's in that boat, but that's why it should have been, hey, you need to stay home from your welding job. You have to for safety. Here is, 80% of your projected salary or whatever, 60% plus some benefits to help you get along through this time and whatever. Then people would be more willing to be like, okay, I'll stay home. I know the government's got my back. But you're right, we didn't have that. We were, hey, stay home and here's one check that'll last you half a month and good luck for the next 9. That just doesn't cut
Yeah.
it. That just doesn't cut it, and that's why people are suffering. And so I don't know. I guess my last takeaway is like so like the one big like we talked about the cultural takeaway. We have like parts of our culture are really toxic and holding us back in times of crisis. The second thing was we've really had a distrust of our government and we've had a distrust of like scientific experts and government experts, but we've also justifiably been upset at our government for not giving the help that we need. And then I think like the third thing would just be like, I don't know, man. Shoot, I just had it. I guess I combined them in the second thing. I guess I combined them in the second thing, which was, we have to have trust in the scientific experts, but we also have realized how much our government has let us down as far as helping us.
Dude,
I remember now. I'm so sorry. The economic aspect. The economic aspect is the difference between the economic realities and what we see in the stock market is bigger than ever, right? For a while we've seen, okay, the stock market isn't everything. The stock market isn't everything. But now it's almost like the stock market doesn't mean anything because we're seeing this V-shaped recovery that has no basis in reality almost, and like meme stocks skyrocketing to the roof. Whereas businesses and employees are tanking. So yeah, that was my last point is we've seen even a farther discrepancy from the reality and what the stock market shows.
well, yeah, I mean, and I wasn't even going to mention this, but I mean, U.S. Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin is in an all-out kind of beef, like public dispute with Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell.
Yeah.
Because Powell for months has been saying we need to effing do something here, and Mnuchin I guess wants to close down all the emergency lending facilities, and there's been a rare public disagreement between the two of them. And in quotes, the Fed retorted basically saying we would prefer that the full like suite of emergency facilities established during the pandemic continue to serve as a backup because people need help in this vulnerable economy. And Trump's advisors are looking at the stock market, and the Federal Reserve is clearly freaked out about what is happening right now.
Yeah.
And it's horrifying, man. And just before we go, really quick, vaccine. I'm really worried that a lot of people aren't going to take it. And it's good for you and I because maybe that'll expedite us getting a vaccine if people don't. But, what we have 3 vaccines now out. I think this is actually kind of bad that a lot of people are now excited about the vaccine because they're going to be irresponsible. We're not going to be normal for a long time. And people are saying, oh, well, there's a vaccine. I'm going to go to a big bar now and party and we're good because there's a vaccine. But that's not the case.
That's a good point. That's a good point. I mean, obviously, you know, I will take a vaccine if it goes through the proper scientific process of clinical trials and peer reviewed and everything, and it's approved by the correct agencies, right? I'm not going to take a vaccine just because Trump said it, but I will take a vaccine if Dr. Anthony Fauci believes that, we've gone through the clinical trials and it's safe to use and we want it for the American public. I'll take that vaccine. And everyone else should. But you're right. That's a good point that like a vaccine is not a golden ticket to freedom because you don't know who has not had it. And unfortunately, because of how divided we are, there's a good amount of population, more than should be, that is probably anti-vax now. I mean, anti-vax used to be something that was like, the weird hippie couple with the crystals and the white person dreadlocks. They'd be anti-vax, you'd be like, whatever, they're just an outlier. Well, I don't think that's an outlier now. I think we probably have a good, not a majority, but a good plethora of people that are probably not going to take this vaccine. If it's something like 15, 20%, I mean, that means that even if you have a vaccine and you go out and partying, you're still endangering other people that could be part of that group or lead it to someone else, right? You're out there partying, you have a vaccine, you're chilling, but you transmit to someone who doesn't have a vaccine, who transmit it to a baby that is not allowed to have a vaccine yet for medical reasons. Now you have 2 transfers over, and you had a vaccine the whole time.
Yeah, man. I totally agree. And, hopefully we don't have a Quarantine Quagmire Part 3 episode, but I kind of feel like we probably will eventually. But
Gosh, yeah.
but I'm just really worried that there's now going to be also a war over who gets the vaccine, just because, for people who don't know, like this, especially Pfizer's vaccine is just interesting because it is a new technology, which a lot of experts, and obviously I'm an idiot with this stuff. So take what I'm saying. I've just read articles on it, but it's a promising new technology, which is like reverse RNA technology. So you actually aren't taking coronavirus, you're taking another protein that's a viral protein. And so this could help with cancer, diabetes, other drugs as well.
Cool.
But the problem is that many vaccines, like especially this vaccine, it primes the immune system by introducing inert fragments, of viral protein. So it gets the body basically to have a reaction, but you're not actually being exposed to the coronavirus. So this adds another question mark to a lot of people. Like, what is this? This is new. There's going to be so many fake news stories going out about this vaccine. And I think, even in New York, like it was like 35% of the state said they wouldn't take it. So we have a serious problem.
35%, that's terrifying. Yeah, yes. That is ridiculous. I expect the 2 to 3% that are just nutcases, but 35% is a failure in information. It is a testament to how bad fake news is. And please, if you're listening to this, please be careful about what news you consume. Take everything for a grain of salt. Even what we're saying here, verify what we say. Verify what we say. I won't take offense. I'll take it as a compliment because that means you're an informed listener. If you see something on Facebook talking about a vaccine, do your damn diligence because Alex is right. There's going to be a ton of misinformation out there, and not all of it's not all of it is like a menacing ulterior motive. It could just be well-meaning people that think they have the right information that don't.
Exactly. And then, we'll have to probably talk about this eventually, but then there's the fact of, do you give it to healthcare workers first? Do you give it to seniors first? Do you give it to like younger people that are out in public working? Yeah. That's going to be complicated. But I don't know if you have any more thoughts, but, it is interesting to see what's changed since our first Quarantine Quagmire episode. I think you and I were much rosier, like you said earlier in the first one. And I think half the country can't see the forest through the trees, and the other half are stuck in the weeds on this. And it's going to be tough, man. It's going to be really tough. And I think we just need to be optimistic. I'm a huge Thanksgiving guy, but I'm not doing Thanksgiving this year. I have seen some friends, but I'm trying to keep it low scale, and I think Americans just need to be responsible and think about the common good, which is hard for a lot of us.
Yeah. FaceTime your grandma this year, maybe, instead of see her, Yeah, we should wrap this one up. Yeah, have a good Thanksgiving, folks. Stay safe. Wear a mask. It's not gonna bite you. You know, it's not gonna. It's not a statement on your manhood. It's a
It's not.
courtesy. It's a courtesy that I think is a simple courtesy that can help a lot of people, and that's what Anthony Fauci's been saying this whole time, or at least most of the time. Yeah, do you want to wrap this one out? Tell them where they can find us and head out of here.
You can find us practically everywhere except for Spotify right now. Still trying to figure that out. But yeah, we're on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, YouTube. We're here on twitch.tv, Tonic Accord. Yeah, thank you guys for listening. Again, have a great Thanksgiving. Stay safe and sane. And we'll be back next week with some more fun topics. So take care.
Take care.